What is up guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to Gran Turismo 7. It's time for my personal update wish list, and if you have any recommendations of your own, leave them in the comment section and I'll go ahead and do a community driven one in the near future. Now this is all about bringing points across to Polyphony in a hope that we can improve Gran Turismo 7 for the better, and I've made this a nice varied list, which should hopefully cater to many different types of GT7 player. So let's begin then with a new track. Gran Turismo 7 is in dire need of a brand new track being added. The last track to be added was Eigen Noordswand in July of 2024, and that only came with two of its layouts, the standard and reverse. Any of the extra layouts were completely absent, and since then we've had no new tracks and no new extra layouts added. Now obviously we do have the Gran Turismo World Series finals kicking off with a live event in London next weekend, and this feels like a great opportunity to do exactly what they did with Eigen Noordswand, release a trailer prior to the update's release and hype up new cars and of course hopefully a new track. We do have confirmation of an update coming in June thanks to the viewers campaign blog post, which does mention the reward cars will be released after the next game update. So it really only makes sense that this is one of their best opportunities to get many eyes over on a new trailer and of course hype up a new track. Next up is Pikes Peak missions. Now I think it's common knowledge that Polyphony do hold the sole rights under the Gran Turismo banner to Pikes Peak Hill Climb. Of course they do sponsor it, and they've had the license since 2017 and it never showed up in sport and it hasn't showed up so far in Gran Turismo 7. Now this could purely be down to the fact that it is a completely different style of event from what we typically see in Gran Turismo. However, that doesn't mean it has to be entirely absent. This could quite easily make for a time trial mode and also missions, something that we saw with Goodwood implemented in Gran Turismo 6 as a completely different style of mission based mode. So I certainly feel that releasing a brand new track entirely and something like Pikes Peak in a mission style mode would be an absolute win for Polyphony. When we think of it, missions haven't been touched for the longest time since just after the game's launch. Let's move on to the next point then, sports mode refresh. Now a lot of the fastest Gran Turismo players are currently on their way out the door going to other things, and there's a lot of reasons for that. However, one of the main things for I think the majority of the players is going to be the fact that sports mode just isn't as fresh as it once was. Implemented during GT Sport, obviously the format has stayed the same pretty much ever since 2017 and has barely received much in terms of content and refreshing updates. Now of course one of the big complaints is that the race car roster in Gran Turismo 7 is massively outdated, with some of these vehicles now coming upwards of 15 years old in a competitive racing game. It really is a huge shame, and of course they do get picked pretty much every week, which leads me to the next point. It's very rinse and repeat, and they don't really step out the comfort zone when it comes to actually planning these weekly races. Now before we get into the next point, I want to give a huge thank you to Digit Racing, who pointed me in the direction of DG Edge. See, up until about 2 months ago, I stepped away from sport mode around about 2.5 years ago, and I just didn't want to touch it anymore. Not only was it very rinse and repeat, there was a massive lack of information in how I was personally improving as a driver, and that's where DG Edge really comes in clutch and allows you to check out every single statistic you can possibly think of and just compare yourself to the rest of the world. All you need to do is go ahead and claim your profile, which is of course linked to your PSN, and from there you have a wealth of information and a huge deep dive into how you're performing as a driver. They also offer coaching sessions if you really want to take your game to the next level, but my personal favorite feature, well, I have to say it's the setups. This channel is known for building cars, and I'll be posting even some of the setups that I don't feature on the channel over on DG Edge, so feel free to head over there and check some of those out. So whilst Polyphony might not be refreshing sport mode, DG Edge sure is. A huge thank you once again to Digit for the recommendation. Moving on then to RNG Removal. One of the worst things about GT7's I guess day-to-day experience is RNG, and whilst they did take some steps forward allowing engine swaps and ultimate tuning parts to be buyable, there is still a ton ton of RNG in this game, mainly to do with the roulette wheel, which is certainly not player focused whatsoever. In fact, 95% of the time you will be given the worst reward possible after already receiving the worst ticket possible. So the way I propose to change it, instead of having a set limit of 26 miles, it should be how much you've driven after a 24-hour period. So let's say one day you drive 500 miles in a day, well the next day you will receive a better ticket and better, more player focused rewards on that roulette wheel, whereas if you only drove 20, you're going to end up with a worse ticket and of course weaker rewards. I think it'll be much more player focused that way. Continuing on with the player focused theme, next up is an obvious one: remove the invites. Look, Polyphony, I'm going to be honest here, this is a very out of date system and it's become almost obsolete for obvious reasons, when we can go ahead and purchase the likes of the Chiron and the Valkyrie straight up from Brand Central, but then have the Vulcan and the Veyron completely locked behind this ridiculous RNG system. It just makes no sense anymore, and you've proven that you can turn them off, because you did so in I believe April or May of 2022 when you received a bunch of backlash. So just turn the system off for good. There's no reason to have this in and have players grinding every day for 3 years to not receive a certain specific invite. And well, if you're not going to disable them, at least let players reach a certain milestone with a certain manufacturer to just go ahead and unlock them that way, instead of relying on RNG. Next up is a physics refresh. Now this is a little bit like what I mentioned when it comes to sport mode. A lot of players really don't like the current physics to GT7, saying that there's too much understeer, there's too much oversteer. The brakes don't feel right, the suspension doesn't feel right, turning into a corner doesn't feel right, going on the exit of a corner doesn't feel right. I've heard so many different opinions. However, it does seem to be a current trend that a lot of people just haven't liked the physics ever since 1.49. And I do tend to agree. Whilst it has had a few different iterations of what seem to be sort of the same physics style since then, overall it does seem to be that a lot of people just don't like them. And honestly, I think I'm kind of included in that. I much preferred the physics prior to 1.49 than what we've had for the last year or so. Whilst I didn't mind too much the 1.49 physics, every iteration of it since then has just been a step backwards. So maybe go to pre 1.49 again. Next up is going to be Sophy AI updates. Now, of course, recently we got Sophy 2.1 and it's absolutely fantastic. And in fact, the sheer potential with Sophy AI to be the best sort of computer AI that we've ever raced against in any racing game is definitely there. I think this will be absolutely incredible for racing games in the near future. However, it is still missing some very key features, that mainly being grid start and racing Sophy in the rain. I certainly feel these are two things they really need to push and get Sophy doing sooner rather than later, to just add to the overall experience, and then hopefully see full implementation when it comes to Gran Turismo 8, etc. And of course I can't mention Sophy AI without mentioning B-Spec, which was kind of shown off at the end of last year at the World Series Finals. That looked like a fantastic addition running on Sophy AI, and honestly it just needs to hurry up. Now next up is going to be wheel and pad users. This is something that I've seen between both the different types of player base, especially over the last few months or so. Now when it comes to both of these, I've seen the assumption that pad users assume they're at a disadvantage to wheel users, which I wouldn't say is necessarily the case until you get to sort of the peak of GT7 players. And of course wheel users go off the assumption that pad players are just absolutely dirty, they're going to ram them and such. And it does seem that there's a huge divide between the two, where they want to be kind of separated from each other. Basically, where the game will just go ahead and detect what device you're inputting, whether that's wheel or controller, and then put you up against similar skilled players who are running on either wheel or pad. And also when it comes to time trial leaderboards, a lot of players are wanting separate different leaderboards between wheel and pad users. I do feel in that sense it does make much more sense, as again a lot of them do feel that they're at a disadvantage, especially when it comes to those faster times. Now of course I'm not going to leave out VR VR players, a VR HUD update for me and a lot of other players would be an absolutely incredible step forward. Now, for the longest time until November of 2024, VR received almost no update when it comes to Gran Turismo 7. Then of course, with the release of the PS5 Pro, it did get a much more clearer and honestly much better image when it comes to running it on that console. However, one thing that VR players have been crying out for the longest time is an update to the HUD, because it really does have a huge lack of proper information, and I fully agree there. In fact, it's one of the things that puts me off racing competitively whilst using my VR headset. Whilst it's great for cruising around, the lack of information when you're trying to be on the ragged edge is really frustrating. So for me, a VR HUD update is a must, and honestly long overdue at this point. I certainly feel like VR players kind of get forgotten when it comes to polyphony. And next up and finally is probably the biggest point of this video: player feedback. I certainly feel for the last couple of months, no matter where you look and no matter the type of GT7 player, whether that's some of the fastest guys in the world, time trial guys, single player guys, sport mode guys, no matter the type of player, it seems that everybody is being really negative about this game. And honestly, it's for good reason. And it does seem to be the direction that Gran Turismo 7 has taken. Now, of course, from the first game to the 6th title, it was all about sort of a deep campaign and a deep, single player experience where you're going through trying all these different cars, from your daily getters to your race cars to your supercars, your JDM cars. There was something for everyone. And of course, as the titles went on, you could jump in rooms with your friends and have a bunch of fun. And then of course we had sport mode, which brought in competitive racing. And then GT7 had the chance to combine both elements, and that's what it's attempted to do. But whilst trying to combine the two with the competitiveness of sport mode and the typical Gran Turismo experience with the campaign and such like that, it has completely butchered both sides. So not only has it disappointed those that wanted the deep GT experience of old, and of course what's been known for the longest time, it's then also disappointed the competitive players that have moved over from sport and might have joined in at that point. So it's tried to combine both and kind of in a sense failed miserably. And I think one thing that Polyphony really need to do when it comes to Gran Turismo is take on board player feedback and show us that they are listening to us as a fan base. At the end of the day, Gran Turismo would be nowhere without its players. What Polyphony really need to do now is show that they are willing to listen to their player base and are actively listening to them to make GT7 a better product overall, and of course help shape the future of Gran Turismo titles. It's very obvious that they tend to want to combine the two with the competitive racing from sport and of course the deep Gran Turismo experience from the games of previous. However, without listening to player feedback on what made all of these titles so great, they will never ever end up with another Gran Turismo 2 or Gran Turismo 4 on their hands. Polyphony really need to remember that it's their player base that made them as successful as they are, and it's their player base that can say goodbye to them at any point as well. Really, they need to take on board player feedback and show that they're listening. But anyway, that's just 10 points from me personally and where I want to see Gran Turismo 7 and of course future titles go with the next update. But let me know what you want in the comment section down below. If your comment's good enough, then it will probably feature in my next community video, which will probably be in a couple of days time. Anyway, I'll see you in the next one. Take care guys, peace.